facilities kind of around the Northeast right now. So this is a fun talk because I get to put together my two favorite things in the world, American shad, or as my grad students, my undergrads know them, the best fish, and numbers. You stop that. So here we go. The great thing about having this towards the end of the symposium is I can cut right to the chase with some numbers too. So the big impetus behind all of this is that we certainly lack quite a bit of information about just general characteristics of shad, but we have a lot of regulated hydro systems on the East Coast. Meaning they have dams in them that are federally regulated. And federal fisheries managers are tasked with coming up with performance standards for passage at those dams. We're all familiar with the fact that American shad are notoriously difficult when it comes to behaving well in fishways for us. And we do know that, at least in some systems, this has had a pretty big impact on populations over the years. So what we're really driving at here is trying to set up a framework that we can use to help managers to build support for or against given sets of regulations, so that those regulations don't come off as being arbitrary and capricious, which are some of your favorite words you can probably find in almost every FERC document ever. And so we also want to make sure that we're doing things in a way that's going to be beneficial to the fish and not serve in the form of traps. So what we're interested in assessing here are influences of upstream passage as effectiveness, and both also as timing, downstream mortality in terms of downrunners, both spawners and juveniles, and then potentially indirect and latent effects of dams on these populations. These are all going to serve as kind of radio buttons in a model that we put together for this stuff. As long as we're looking at all this, we're going to layer on fisheries and climate change as well. I'm not going to go into that stuff today because there's just not enough time. So where we all started with this was with Atlantic salmon. And Atlantic salmon, for those of you who haven't had the wonderful opportunity to work with them, are really clean fish in terms of modeling, right? We've got some pretty good information on homing, and we can do some cool stuff with them. Julie Nealand out of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center has really kind of harnessed that information in building what are effectively some state-based models for Atlantic salmon life history. And NOAA's been using those for a while now to come up with, or to inform, more appropriately, to inform fish passage standards at dams in Maine especially. So Julie, Tim Sheehan, and a few other people kind of laid the groundwork for this for us. It's also something that's been happening on the West Coast with various different species. So we're not inventing the wheel here, but we are trying to deal with is the fact that we don't have great information about homing and shad. We know they go back to the rivers they came from most of the time, but then once you get inside of a given river, attempts so far at sort of laying out population structures don't really result in much other than, yes, they're from this river, right? And so this really presents a challenge in terms of the modeling. We can't do this fun matrix math that Julie was doing, and we're also faced now with the challenge of making something that's reasonably dependable, because folks are trying to use these things to support decisions about fish that aren't listed. So we have slightly duller regulatory teeth in that context, right? These present real challenges. So we've got this need. I started this way back when as a postdoc. We're still working on it today because it's so much darn fun. And what we're really trying to do here is to create some kind of modeling framework. This is organizational, thought experiment kind of style, right? These are heuristic exercises. But we want to be able to assess dam impacts on fish populations. We want to be able to incorporate all that uncertainty out there about American shad life history, and there's a lot of it. And we also want to be able to plug some environmental variability and ultimately fisheries information into this. This started out really early on. That's the gray computer on my desk if my students haven't seen the inside of it. And we start basically with a giant envelope that we can do some back of the envelope calculations on, all right? These are all fairly simple processes that we're smooshing together. This is the only model slide I'll show, I promise. And for those of you who that really took some effort. All right, so here's the sort of conceptual framework for the model that we're working with. What we have are essentially a classic cohort-based model, projection models like we might use in stock assessment. And then rather than having a spawn recruit curve stuck in there, we've got an individual-based model in terms of upstream migration here. Okay, and so what we're doing is we're taking a population that we're going to simulate with various life history characteristics, their sex-specific, river-specific information there, and we take a simulated population of fish, we put those into a river, and we can start to do things. So we can start to move fish through the river. Those rates of movement are tied to things like temperature and their body size, so of course their sex. And then dams as well, right? That would be really useful for this effort. And so we've also got dams layered in here. And so the basic idea is you simulate 10,000 fish, you put them into a little video game inside of the computer, and you start to move fish throughout the system based on a set of predefined rules. This is all happening with random draws from distributions. The fish move up through the river, they can accumulate in production units is what we're going to call them, and then we basically group everybody together, do some fun math, send them back out to the ocean, and do the whole thing again. We do this for 50 years standard just because that's the default license lifetime. In the Connecticut, I think we're working with 40 years. And we're going to repeat this 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 times, however much we need to sample to actually do this adequately. All right, so you don't need to read this. This is just kind of where it all started. This all originated as just one giant file. And it would take, like 3 weeks to run. So I get a call from Bill McDavid or Sean McDermott up at Garfo, and they say, okay, we want to assess these passage options at some dam in a river. I say, okay, I'll call you in 21 days. It'll be great. Clearly, that's not the time frame that any of us are used to working on anymore for those kinds of decisions. And we're doing this far enough out in advance that we kind of have a built-in buffer anyway. Most of the licenses that we're working on right now are still quite some time out. So anyway, we get over the ugliness. We send this all in for review. Next slide, please. And I started talking with a fantastic scientific programmer over at the University of Buffalo. They have a massive supercomputer there that they just want people to use, but there's nobody around to geek out on it. So I started working with Jeanette. She's amazing. We got some money to bring on a grad student, Erin, in the back there. And the really cool thing about this is this lets us set things up instead of on my laptop or instead of the cool blue computer on 90 computers at once, right? And all of a sudden, really rapidly, oh yeah, also, I mentioned Jeanette's a programmer. She cleaned up my life. It was amazing. Things started going really fast. And now we go from 3 weeks for 10,000 model runs. I ran a set of model runs for the Connecticut Friday, and it took about an hour and a half. That was 10 or 20,000 runs. So like some crazy improvements going on here. And this is not stuff that was anywhere near my wheelhouse before I started, yeah. So we all sent this all in for review, and it sat at CJFAS for a while, and overkill response to a reviewer request, rather than just making the code available, which we had intended to do anyway. I was like, why don't we just write an R package? This will be great, and then everybody can use it. So that started last summer. In the meantime, review went on and on and on. The big point here is that we went from about 1,000 lines of code in one file to about 14,000 lines of code at the time that I took this screenshot. The models, the whole system's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but it's getting easier to use and faster. Next slide, please. So where are we doing this? We're doing this basically all along the East Coast right now. We started up in Penobscot and the Connecticut rivers, and now we're sort of slowly marching our way down the coast. We've got the Penobscot River all the way to the north in Maine. The Merrimack River is the next south or west, depending on how you want to read that map. The Connecticut, and then the Susquehanna is the beast in the middle of the map there. Yes, sir. All right, so we've got some nice maps, but we really need our models. And we're just going to take a second and start to simplify these things. The Penobscot River is the only map I'm going to show because these all just become a series of circles and rectangles to me. All right, so we have the Penobscot River here. I don't care if you know what every single one of those dams are, though Ian, I suspect you do. And what we're going to start to do is simplify this by breaking the system down into units of habitat. all right? We want to account for these production units that I mentioned before, and we're going to do that by quantifying, right now, surface area in between dams. And we're going to work with some really back-of-the-envelope stuff to convert that into carrying capacity. I should double quote that, not just single quote it. So we've got the dams and their locations, and we've got, in this system, 4 different migration routes. This is so much easier to work with, right? So that big complex map now can boil down into something that's relatively simple. Across the bottom we have the Roman numerals indicating the 4 different passage routes that are slightly washed out. But basically fish can go up through the main stem and stay there all the way to the utmost extent of the main stem. They can go around a hydro complex here in the center of the river and go that route, or they can do both of those things and bear west at the Piscataquis River, which is the largest trib in this system. All main stem focused right now for all of these systems. These are all log proportional to the amount of habitat we think is available for American shad spawning and juvenile rearing prior to out migration. So one of my favorite things to do, and you can do this kind of stuff when you're in a computer, is to reach down with my simulator's fingers and pluck dams out of the rivers, right? And so we can do that by imposing 100% passage efficiencies over a near sort of undefined time period in order to establish what we think are reasonable estimates of contemporary baselines, based on the information that's going into these models, right? We are assuming a lot of stuff when we build these. But we're also assuming a lot of uncertainty. And people love these kinds of confidence intervals, right? So those are 95% confidence intervals around our population estimate over the course of 50 years in the Penobscot if we had perfect passage at every dam in that system, all right? This is a similar graph here. It's just showing this no dam scenario versus no passage scenario. All right? There's a little bit of spawning habitat downstream of lowermost dam in the river. They've been subsisting there for a long time in low numbers. And we know that. With recent removals, we think this is a reasonable first guess at what you might expect to see now in the lowermost reaches of that river, the lower graph there. And one thing to note here is that these are both in hundreds of thousands of fish here. So the 20s, 2 million fish, 200,000 fish. There's an order of magnitude difference there in case you haven't picked up on it. And this is just a result of that. Historically, shad would have had access at least to the fall line at the lowermost dam, but very likely would have been able to pass that one. Cool. Now we can also do cool things like try out a whole bunch of downstream passage rates and a whole bunch of upstream passage rates, for example. This is what happens if we go and test out different combinations of upstream passage efficiencies on the X and downstream passage efficiencies on the Y. What you have is a contour plot. You can think of it like an elevation map. In this case, dark colors are high abundances. And you can see that upstream passage, yeah, it matters to a point, but downstream passage is really what appears to be driving population recovery in this population. So the idea here is that if you get fish upstream, they've got to get back down, right? And so on the left side, you see what happens when we impose a 1-day passage time on that group. And on the right-hand side, these dashed lines are the interim recovery target. On the right-hand side, you see under a 48-hour time, that's really difficult to reach. Again, a lot of assumptions built in. Thanks. All right, here's the Connecticut River. It never looked so simple, did it? We got a similar thing going on here, but now we've boiled it down to a couple of passage options here. And this is really simplified, all right? That center of the map is the Turner's Falls complex. I'm not going to get into the layout, but it's complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on. That black dot is a no habitat marker, okay? And that is being managed, that is being modeled that way because of what the managers, the biologists, the ecologists working on the Connecticut River said was appropriate. We can do that in various systems. All right, so here we're going to just look at scope of impact again, but right now we're doing some runs for that group on the Turners Falls and Northfield Mountain relicensing. The other cool thing about the Connecticut River is it's got a pump power storage facility there up in mid-river. I guess cool, yeah, sorry. No quotes for that one. And so this is, it's another wrench in the works, right? We got to figure out how we can evaluate this and how it fits in with regulations. So we're going to look at that too. Also, as Tom indicated, there is a lot of downstream habitat in this system. And you can kind of see that come to bear. Here's where we'd be looking at a 50-year mean under a full upstream passage scenario. And that aligns pretty well with maxed out populations that we have information about from the later part of the last century. This is the only plot I think I'm going to show for any results from the Connecticut. This is showing abundance at the mouth of the river, and really interesting in this system because there's so much downstream spawning, rearing habitat. Upstream is good to a point, but then unless downstream passage is perfect, it's not that good. And unless survival and entrainment at Northfield's really good, then moving fish upstream can actually do more harm than good. And so we are starting to evaluate these kinds of trade-offs both here, and actually we're seeing the same thing in the Penobscot. I suspect, though, as we start to move on through other systems, that might change. Can you skip that one for me? Cool. The big point here is that we see opposite trends in repeat spawners, right? If you move fish upstream and they die coming down through dams, you're going to lose fish. You're going to lose repeats, period. And none of us really started to think about that too hard until we were trying to figure out what the heck just happened in this model. And this is something that folks are thinking about now. The Merrimack's arguably the simplest model we're working with right now. This one's up and running. We've got some relicensing approaching. I just wanted to put this one to show the variability overall. And this is also our smallest population. This, again, is only including main stem habitat. You put in the tribs in the Merrimack, these numbers go up quite a bit, about double. And so then the last one here is the Susquehanna River. This is the three-headed beast that we're dealing with right now. It's a really complex system. There are at least 12 dams we're working to be able to evaluate. If you know the Susquehanna well, you will notice there are a number of dams missing out of the North Branch alone. Been working really closely with Sheila Eiler and John Suica on putting this one together. We don't have anything impending in terms of relicensing, but we do want to be ready if it's ever needed or just for academic interest. So it's there, and the other crazy thing about this system is that